going to be defending Canada. Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
Donald Trump's decision landed with a finality markets understand instantly. Within hours of the order, fuel prices lurched, power planners issued alerts, and farm suppliers froze shipments. The assumption was leverage. The consequence was exposure. By treating Canada as pressurable, the White House misread ownership of the choke points that keep engines running, lights on, and food moving. This is not a negotiating scare. It is the moment when integrated systems snap under a single decision and begin cascading on their own timetable. I assess this as the turning point where options narrow faster than statements can keep up. From here, every hour compounds the cost. The map has not changed, and the wall is already up. On Sunday morning, January 25th, 2026, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 109 and set a clock he could not see. The decision imposed a blanket 25% tariff on Canadian imports, framed publicly as leverage to force renegotiation. The underlying assumption was simple: Canada would absorb the shock and return to the table. That assumption collapsed by early afternoon. Inside the White House, aides briefed on projected revenue gains and political optics. The institutional logic was familiar: apply pressure, extract concessions, declare victory. But institutions outside the West Wing read the same order differently. By 3 p.m. Eastern, energy traders were recalculating refinery inputs, not tariffs. By nightfall, regional utilities were asking whether supply continuity still held. This was the first narrowing. Trump's move treated Canada as a counterparty. The system treated Canada as infrastructure. In my assessment, that distinction mattered more than any negotiating posture. When Ottawa responded by invoking national authorities to restrict exports, the response did not look like retaliation. It looked like control. A second institutional scene unfolded almost immediately. At the Department of Energy, staff issued alerts to grid operators in the Midwest and Texas, not because of weather, but because feedstock assumptions had broken. Refineries configured for heavy crude could not pivot on command. Agricultural suppliers, watching rail manifests stall, began warning of fertilizer gaps ahead of the spring window. High-attention reality set in quickly. Gas prices moved before statements did. Trading desks halted activity before diplomats boarded planes. And the language shifted from tariff schedules to operational continuity. Trump's decision-making here was adversarial by design, but it collided with systems that do not negotiate on television timelines. Leverage fails when it mistakes dependence for weakness. By the evening of January 25th, the corridor of options had already narrowed. Waivers would signal retreat. Escalation would deepen shortages. Delay would compound costs. From this point forward, every institutional response would be defensive, not strategic, and the consequences would accelerate regardless of intent. The escalation did not arrive as a speech. It arrived as paperwork. According to official documents circulated late Sunday, export licenses covering energy, minerals, and agricultural inputs were paused pending review. That phrase, pending review, was enough to trigger defensive behavior across multiple sectors. By Monday morning, January 26th, shipping schedules were rewritten, rail traffic slowed at border crossings, and utilities began drawing down contingency inventories. The timeline tightened quickly. Before markets opened, Midwest refiners issued notices to suppliers acknowledging potential throughput reductions within 72 hours. By mid-morning, agricultural distributors warned farm cooperatives that potassium deliveries might miss the April planting window if rail restrictions were held. According to statements from grid operators, reserve margins were being reassessed, not because demand surged, but because inputs were uncertain. This was not a single shock. It was synchronized friction. Heavy crude mismatches limited refinery output. Uranium licensing pauses intersected with nuclear refueling cycles measured in months, not weeks. Fertilizer delays collided with a calendar that does not wait. Each system had its own clock, and none aligned with political messaging. High-attention indicators piled up. Commodity desks suspended trading to manage volatility. Regional price spreads widened beyond historical bands. Utilities quietly requested federal coordination calls. And inside Washington, the conversation shifted from leverage to exemptions. Trump's decision-making posture here faced an adversarial reality. Systems respond to constraints, not rhetoric. I judge this phase as the moment escalation became self-sustaining. Even if announcements softened tone, operators had already locked in defensive moves. According to public reporting, contingency planning replaced negotiation as the priority across agencies and firms. That substitution is costly, and it is hard to reverse once activated. Escalation hardens when calendars outrun politics. The institutional reaction also exposed a blind spot. The assumption that tariffs could be finely tuned ignored how integrated supply chains propagate uncertainty. When Ottawa's measures intersected with U.S. licensing, the effect multiplied. Notices begat notices. Caution begat stoppages. The machinery of compliance moved faster than diplomacy. By late afternoon, January 26th, briefings acknowledged what markets had priced in hours earlier. Waivers were being discussed. Yet the very act of considering waivers signaled vulnerability. It told suppliers to hold back, not surge. It told partners to wait, not commit. In adversarial terms, Trump's options narrowed. Again, pressing forward risked visible shortages. Backing off risked credibility. The forward pressure was unmistakable. Each additional day of review increased the probability that temporary pauses would become missed cycles. Missed cycles do not reset with press releases. They carry forward into fuel availability, grid stability, and food prices. From here, time itself became the opposing force, and it was moving against the White House. The climax arrived not as a single failure, but as three systems failing in parallel. Oil, electricity, and food do not normally break together. When they do, it is because a decision upstream has removed optionality downstream. This is where Donald Trump's tariff order stopped being a trade instrument and became an operational shock. First, oil. In the Midwest, refinery managers did not debate ideology. They stared at feedstock charts. According to public reporting, roughly 70% of refinery inputs across PADD depend on Canadian heavy crude. This is not preference, it is design. These facilities were engineered decades ago to digest dense, sulfur-heavy oil, the kind that flows from Alberta through Enbridge systems and operational segments of Keystone. When those flows slowed, the refineries did not switch sources. They throttled down. Picture the scene at a control room outside Chicago. Screens show crude arriving thinner than expected. Units calibrated for heavy blend struggle. Output forecasts are revised downward again. Within hours, dispatchers notify distributors that diesel allocations will be cut. This is not price pressure. This is availability pressure. Gas stations can absorb higher prices. They cannot sell fuel they do not receive. Time pressure number one, 72 hours. That is the window many stations operate on before tanks run dry. By the second night, truck routes are being triaged. Priority shifts to emergency services and freight corridors. Ordinary commuters are not in the model. Trump's assumption was that tariffs would raise revenue. The reality was that they raised triage. Second, electricity. Nuclear power does not react quickly, which is exactly why it is dangerous when it does. According to official documents, the United States imports approximately 95% of its nuclear fuel. After Russian supply was banned in 2024, Canada became the primary secure source. Cameco's mines in the Athabasca Basin, including Cigar Lake and MacArthur River, sit at the center of that dependency. Now, place yourself inside a nuclear plant scheduled for refueling this spring. Fuel assemblies are ordered months in advance. Licenses matter. When Ottawa paused export approvals and designated uranium as a strategic asset, utilities did not panic publicly. They recalculated quietly. According to statements from grid planners, if refueling schedules slip, plants must power down. There is no workaround, no overtime fix. Nuclear safety rules are unforgiving by design. Time pressure number two, 18 to 24 months. That is the fuel cycle. Plants cannot wait and see indefinitely. As summer demand approaches, losing even a fraction of nuclear baseload forces grids to lean harder on gas and coal. But gas is already constrained by refinery disruptions. This is how independent shocks synchronize. Imagine a heat wave rolling across the eastern seaboard. Air conditioners surge, operators call for reserves, and a nuclear unit flags a delayed refueling. The math tightens instantly. Rolling outages move from contingency to planning. I assess this as the moment when energy independence rhetoric collapsed under calendar math. Third, food. Potash is not visible to consumers, which makes it lethal when it disappears. Saskatchewan produces nearly 1/3 of global supply and about 85% of what American farmers use. According to public reporting, when rail shipments were halted and tariffs layered on minerals, distributors warned that inventories would not bridge to April. Viewer in the scene moment. A farmer in Iowa standing in an equipment shed, fertilizer bins half empty, checking the calendar. The planting window does not negotiate. If potassium is not in the soil on time, yields fall. Corn feeds cattle, soy feeds poultry. This is a chain, not a headline. Time pressure number 3, 30 days. That is the margin before planting windows close. Miss it, and yields drop by 30 to 40%. Prices do not inch up, they jump. Analysts modeled a $15 Big Mac by midsummer, not as satire, but as shorthand for protein inflation. This is not a theory, it is agronomy. These three pressures intersected in real time. Oil shortages raised transport costs, electricity risk threatened processing and storage, fertilizer gaps endangered supply months out, and none of it responded to speeches. Trump's decision-making style thrives on confrontation, but confrontation does not create molecules. It does not enrich uranium. It does not crystallize potassium. Overlay the geopolitical layer and the picture darkens. According to statements from Canadian officials, the Trans Mountain expansion had opened a Pacific outlet. Canadian heavy crude no longer had to clear south. A strategic partnership with CIPC meant tankers queued in Vancouver, not pipelines in Illinois. Control shifted from buyer to owner. Time pressure number 4, weeks, not years. Long enough for contracts to be signed, short enough that reversals would not unwind them. By pushing Canada away, Washington accelerated diversification it had long feared. Now add aluminum. According to Department of Defense assessments, secure access to Canadian aluminum underpins aircraft, vehicles, and munitions. Quebec's hydropowered smelters feed U.S. manufacturers because American electricity costs killed domestic capacity decades ago. When tariffs hit, just-in-time supply chains snapped. Ford and GM announced line suspensions. The UAW mobilized, not against Ottawa, but against Washington. Time pressure number 5, payroll cycles. When shifts are canceled, political pressure follows. This is where control versus ownership becomes decisive. The United States controls demand. Canada owns resources. In integrated systems, ownership wins. I offer a personal analytical judgment here. This was not a miscalculation of intent. It was a miscalculation of physics. Geography does not care about leverage. Pipelines, rail lines, and reactors obey constraints, not slogans. Systems break where ownership outranks control. As these pressures converged, Trump's corridor narrowed to a sliver. Escalation risked visible shortages, waivers signaled retreat, delay compounded damage. According to public reporting, internal discussions shifted toward temporary exemptions, language designed to save face while reopening valves. But operators did not surge supply on promises. They waited for licenses, contracts, and certainty. The irreversible feeling set in here. Even if exemptions arrived, trust had already thinned. Canada had demonstrated it could redirect flows. China had demonstrated it would buy. Markets had demonstrated they would punish uncertainty. This is the climax because it is where choice collapses into consequence. By the end of the week, the lesson was unmistakable. You can tariff a country, you cannot tariff geology, you can threaten a partner, you cannot threaten a calendar. Trump's decision exposed an empire optimized for consumption, not resilience. And once that exposure is visible, it cannot be unseen. What changed after the climax was not policy language, it was institutional memory. Systems that had treated integration as a convenience began pricing it as a risk. According to public reporting, procurement teams rewrote playbooks, not to optimize costs, but to reduce exposure to single-owner choke points. This is how crises linger long after headlines fade. Assumptions are revised. Risk repricing followed quickly. Utilities adjusted reserve targets. Refiners widened safety margins and accepted lower utilization rather than gamble on uncertain blends. Agricultural lenders tightened terms. anticipating volatility in yields and input costs. Inside federal agencies, coordination calls multiplied, but their purpose shifted. The question was no longer how to win the dispute, it was how to avoid repeating it. High-attention reality settled in across institutions. Markets demanded clarity and received conditionality. Supply chains demanded certainty and received timelines. The mismatch mattered. When certainty is replaced by review, capital waits. When capital waits, capacity shrinks. Trump's decision-making now faced an adversarial environment shaped by memory, not momentum. Here is the sentence that anchors this phase, and it matters precisely because it is understated. The danger is not collapse. The danger is fragility. Fragility is what emerges when systems keep running but lose tolerance for shocks. It is invisible until it isn't. And once fragility is recognized, every future decision is judged against it. I offer a personal analytical judgment. The lasting change is not that Canada proved leverage. It is that U.S. institutions internalized dependence. According to statements from officials, diversification plans accelerated not to punish anyone, but to survive the next disruption. That shift dilutes presidential leverage regardless of who occupies the office. Memory, once written into systems, outlasts mandates. Institutional memory also reshaped alliances. Defense planners revisited assumptions about aluminum, fuel, and surveillance dependencies. NORAD coordination remained intact, but its context hardened. Trade negotiators recalibrated, recognizing that partners with options behave differently than partners without them. In practical terms, this means fewer ultimatums and more pre-clearance, less brinkmanship, more buffers. The political effect was subtler but persistent. Workers sent home by line suspensions remembered timing. Farmers staring at planting windows remembered delays. Grid operators tracking reserve margins remembered silence between approvals. None of this requires outrage to endure. It requires repetition. By the close of this phase, the forward pressure was structural. Even a full de-escalation would not restore the previous baseline. Contracts would include exit clauses. Inventories would run thicker. Capital would price uncertainty higher. Trump's narrowing corridor now ran through a terrain shaped by caution, not confidence. And caution, once institutionalized, resists reversal. De-escalation, when it arrived, did not look like victory. It looked like a process. According to public reporting, exemptions were discussed in narrow lanes, framed as temporary and technical rather than political. Valves reopened incrementally. Licenses resumed with conditions. The language was careful because the objective had changed. It was no longer to extract concessions. It was to stabilize systems already strained. This is how controlled landings work. They reduce altitude without restoring confidence. Operators move first, markets follow cautiously, and institutions document lessons. Trump's decision-making now operated inside a smaller box, bounded by calendars and contracts he did not write. I assess this as the enduring outcome. Leverage ceded to reliability. There are signals worth watching that cut through rhetoric. First, licensing cadence. When approvals return to predictable intervals, operators will rebuild flow. If pauses recur, fragility persists. Second, inventory behavior. Drawdowns replaced by accumulation signal regain tolerance for shocks. Third, routing choices. Sustained volumes moving through Pacific outlets rather than Midwest pipelines indicate diversification has stuck. These signals matter because they reflect ownership, not messaging. Control speaks loudly, ownership speaks last. The weeks after the crisis showed that partners with alternatives negotiate differently. That reality narrows options for any administration that confuses demand with dominance. Here is my personal analytical judgment. The episode did not end American power. It redefined it. Power that ignores geography spends itself quickly. Power that respects constraints lasts longer, but it demands humility in execution. Stability is restored by predictability, not bravado. The professional takeaway is straightforward. Future policy will be tested against resilience metrics before it is sold as leverage. Agencies will ask whether a move introduces optionality or removes it. Markets will price uncertainty faster than statements can offset. And allies will invest in exits the moment they are reminded that exits exist. If you want to track whether the landing is holding, watch the indicators that precede headlines. Energy feedstock flows, nuclear refueling schedules, fertilizer deliveries ahead of planting windows. When these align quietly, risk is easing. When they diverge, pressure is returning. For continued, disciplined analysis on how policy decisions translate into real-world constraints, follow this channel. We will keep separating control from ownership and consequences from claims, with a focus on what actually moves systems next.